When a grieving Texas widow discovers 3 starving Comanche children abandoned in the wilderness, her act of mercy sets in motion a chain of events that will transform not only her empty life, but challenge everything the frontier believes about family, loyalty, and love. As their warrior father emerges from the shadows to reclaim his children, will Margaret's promise to protect them destroy the fragile peace she's built, or forge an impossible bond that defies the very laws of a nation at war? The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet like a gunshot. Margaret O'Brien dropped her coffee cup, watching the dark liquid spread across her kitchen floor like spilled blood. Outside her cabin window, storm clouds gathered over the Texas plains, and she wondered if the weather knew something she didn't about this November day in 1862. Her hands shook as she bent to clean up the mess. 2 years had passed since James died fighting Cherokee raiders, but her body still jumped at every unexpected noise. The empty cabin felt like a tomb most days, too quiet, too still, too full of memories that whispered from every corner. Margaret straightened and looked around the kitchen that once buzzed with life. James used to sit at that wooden table, reading letters from his brother in Austin while she cooked breakfast. Now dust gathered on the chair where he used to laugh at her terrible jokes. The silence pressed against her ears until she wanted to scream just to hear something, anything, fill the hollow space. She walked to the front door and stepped onto the porch. The November wind cut through her thin dress, making her wrap her arms around herself for warmth. In the distance, she could see the neighbors' farms dotting the landscape like tiny islands in an ocean of brown grass. The Kowalski family lived closest, about 2 miles east, but they might as well have been on the moon for all the company they provided. The townspeople in Fredericksburg whispered about her when she came to buy supplies. "Poor Margaret," they'd say, shaking their heads. "A woman alone ain't natural. She should remarry or move back east with her sister." But Margaret had nowhere else to go. This land held everything she'd ever loved, even if love had abandoned her. Her fingers found the silver locket hanging from her neck. James had given it to her on their wedding day, promising to fill it with pictures of their children. The locket remained empty, just like everything else in her life. She tried to have babies, but each pregnancy ended in heartbreak until the doctor told her to stop trying. Some women weren't meant to be mothers, he'd said, as if that was supposed to comfort her. Margaret walked to the edge of her property where James had built a fence to keep their cattle safe. Raiders had stolen the animals last spring, leaving her with nothing but bills she couldn't pay and land she couldn't work alone. The bank in town had offered to buy her out, but she'd refused. This place was all she had left of the dreams she'd shared with her husband. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the empty fields. Margaret watched it hunt, envying its purpose, its certainty. She used to have purpose too, back when James was alive and their future stretched ahead like a road with no end. Now each day felt like walking through mud, heavy and pointless. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something that made her skin crawl with unease. She'd learned to trust her instincts out here on the frontier. Women who ignored their gut feelings didn't last long in Texas. Something was different about today, wrong somehow, like the moment before lightning strikes. Margaret turned to go back inside when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. It was crying, but not human crying. Not animal either. Something in between, desperate and afraid. The sound came from the direction of the old creek that ran behind her property, through the mesquite thicket where James used to hunt rabbits. She hesitated at the door, her hand on the wooden handle. Smart women didn't investigate strange sounds alone. Smart women waited for their husbands or called for help. But Margaret had learned that sometimes being smart meant being dead, and sometimes being foolish meant staying alive. She grabbed James's rifle from beside the door, checking to make sure it was loaded. The gun felt heavy in her hands, heavier than it used to when James taught her to shoot. "A woman alone needs to know how to protect herself," he'd said, making her practice until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. She'd hated those lessons then, but now she whispered a prayer of thanks for his stubbornness. The crying continued, fainter now, as if whatever was making the sound was getting weaker. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped off the porch and headed toward the creek. Each step took her further from the safety of her cabin and deeper into the unknown. The storm clouds overhead seemed to be watching her, waiting to see what she would do. As she walked, Margaret thought about the stories she'd heard in town about Indian raids, about settlers found dead in their homes, about children taken in the night never to be seen again. The war had made everyone jumpy, suspicious of shadows and strangers. But the crying didn't sound dangerous. It sounded lost, helpless, like something that needed saving rather than something that meant harm. The mesquite branches grabbed at her dress as she pushed through the thicket. Thorns caught her sleeves and scratched her arms, but she kept moving toward the sound. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. And Margaret O'Brien, despite all her fears and loneliness, couldn't turn away from something that might need her help. Blood stained the broken wagon wheel, dark drops that told a story Margaret didn't want to read. She crouched behind a large rock, her rifle ready, watching the overturned wagon that lay half-hidden in the creek bed like a dead animal. The crying had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt more dangerous than any sound. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she was sure it could be heard for miles. She'd found the source of the strange noises, but now she wished she'd stayed in her cabin with the door locked tight. The wagon looked like it had been attacked, its canvas torn and goods scattered across the muddy ground. She could see broken pottery, torn clothing, and something that might have been food supplies now ruined by the creek water. Then she saw movement. Something small shifted beneath the wagon's broken axle, and the crying started again, softer now, weaker, like whatever was making the sound was running out of strength. Margaret's grip tightened on her rifle as she tried to decide what to do. Every instinct told her to run, to get back to her cabin and pretend she'd never heard anything. But another part of her, the part that remembered being helpless and alone, wouldn't let her feet move backward. She took a deep breath and called out in a voice that shook despite her efforts to sound brave. "Hello? Is someone there? I want to help." The crying stopped instantly, as if someone had put a hand over her mouth. Margaret waited, counting her heartbeats, watching for any sign of movement. The storm clouds overhead rumbled with distant thunder, and she realized she was running out of time before the rain started. Whatever she was going to do, she needed to do it fast. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, taking a step closer to the wagon. "I live nearby. I can help." A small face appeared from beneath the wagon, dark eyes wide with terror and something else, hope, maybe, or desperation. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was a child, but not just any child. The dark skin, the black hair, the way the small face was shaped. This was an Indian child, probably Comanche from the look of him. Margaret's first thought was to run. Everyone knew that where there was one Indian, there were usually more. Everyone knew that Comanche children meant Comanche warriors weren't far behind. Everyone knew that getting involved with Indians meant trouble, the kind of trouble that got white settlers killed. But as she looked at the small face staring back at her, Margaret saw something that made her forget everything she'd been taught about being careful. The child was starving. She could see it in the hollow cheeks, the way the small shoulders shook with weakness, the desperate hunger in those dark eyes. This wasn't a dangerous warrior or a threatening enemy. This was a baby, maybe 3 years old, who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Then she saw the others. 2 more small faces appeared beside the first, another boy and a girl, all about the same age, all with the same hollow look of children who were dying slowly. Triplets, Margaret realized with a shock that went through her like cold water. 3 babies, alone and starving, hiding under a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere. The girl began to cry again, a weak sound that broke Margaret's heart. The boys tried to comfort her, making soft sounds that might have been words in their own language. They were so small, so fragile, like birds that had fallen from their nest. Without thinking, Margaret took another step forward. The children pressed closer together, fear and hope fighting in their expressions. They were afraid of her, but they were more afraid of being alone. Margaret understood that feeling better than anyone. She'd been alone for 2 years, and every day was a battle against the fear that she would die with no one to care, no one to remember her name. "It's okay," she whispered, setting her rifle down on the ground where they could see it. "I won't hurt you. Are you hungry?" The word hungry, seemed to mean something to them. All three children looked at her with expressions that made her want to cry. When was the last time they'd eaten? How long had they been hiding under this wagon, waiting for someone to find them or for death to take them? Margaret looked around the area, trying to understand what had happened. The wagon was definitely attacked. She could see arrow holes in the wood and signs of a struggle in the disturbed earth. But where were the adults? Where were the parents of these children? As if reading her thoughts, the oldest boy, she thought he was the oldest because he seemed to be trying to protect the other two, pointed toward the creek and said something in his language. His voice was so quiet she could barely hear him, but the sadness in his tone needed no translation. Their parents were gone, dead or taken, and these three babies were all that remained of whatever family had been traveling in this wagon. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy. The children looked up at the sky with expressions of pure terror, as if they knew they wouldn't survive a storm in their condition. Margaret made a decision that would change everything, though she didn't know it at the time. "Come with me," she said, extending her hand toward them. "I have food at my house. I have a warm place to sleep. You'll be safe." The children looked at each other, having a silent conversation with their eyes. The girl reached out first, her tiny hand barely touching Margaret's fingers. The touch sent a shock through Margaret's system. When was the last time another person had touched her? When was the last time she'd felt needed, wanted, important to someone else's survival? One by one, the three children crawled out from under the wagon. They were even smaller than Margaret had thought, their clothes torn and dirty, their small bodies shaking with cold and hunger. She wanted to pick them all up and carry them, but she was just one woman and they were three children who didn't know if they could trust her. Instead, she stood slowly, making sure they could see every movement, and picked up her rifle. The children watched her carefully, ready to run if she pointed the weapon at them. But Margaret slung the rifle over her shoulder and held out both hands. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's go home." The smallest child stopped breathing in the middle of the night, and Margaret thought her heart would explode from terror. She pressed her ear to the little girl's chest, listening desperately for any sound of life while the two boys watched with eyes that had seen too much death already. Then, like a miracle, tiny lungs filled with air again, and Margaret nearly sobbed with relief. 3 weeks had passed since she'd brought the children home, 3 weeks of the hardest work she'd ever done in her life. Teaching them that the cabin was safe took days. Teaching them that food would come regularly took longer. The oldest boy, who she'd started calling Running Deer because of how fast he moved, had stuffed bread under his shirt the first week, saving it like a squirrel preparing for winter. Margaret had given them names because she needed something to call them, and somehow the names felt right. Running Deer for the boy who never sat still, always watching the doors and windows like he was ready to run. Little Wolf for the middle child who growled when he was scared and protected his siblings like a wild animal. Singing Bird for the girl who hummed constantly under her breath, sad little songs that broke Margaret's heart every time she heard them. The cabin that had felt too big and empty now buzzed with activity from sunrise to sunset. Margaret had never realized how much noise 3 small children could make. The patter of bare feet on wooden floors, the sound of whispered conversations in a language she didn't understand, the crash of things being knocked over by curious hands exploring their new world. She'd had to move all of James's breakable things to high shelves after Little Wolf accidentally knocked over a lamp on his second day. The boy had cowered in the corner, expecting punishment, but Margaret had just cleaned up the pieces and showed him how to be more careful. The relief on his face had been worth more than any lamp. Sleep became a luxury Margaret barely remembered. Singing Bird woke up screaming from nightmares at least 3 times each night, and the boys took turns getting sick from eating too much too fast after weeks of starvation. Margaret spent hours walking the floor with fevered children, singing Irish lullabies her grandmother had taught her decades ago in a different world. But slowly, impossibly, they began to trust her. Running Deer started sitting closer to her during meals instead of positioning himself near the door for a quick escape. Little Wolf let her touch his forehead when he was sick instead of biting her hand like a trapped animal. Singing Bird began to smile, tiny expressions of happiness that lit up her whole face and made Margaret's chest warm with something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. The hardest part was the language barrier. Margaret spoke only English and a little Irish from her childhood. The children chattered constantly in Comanche, and she could only guess at what they were saying by watching their faces and gestures. When Running Deer pointed to the window and spoke rapidly with worry in his voice, was he asking about his parents? When Little Wolf touched her silver locket and said something soft, was he asking about James? She started teaching them English words by pointing at objects and repeating their names over and over. Bread, she would say, holding up a slice. Water, cup, safe. The children were smart and picked up new words quickly, but Margaret knew she was learning their language too, picking up sounds and meanings from the way they moved their hands when they talked. The real breakthrough came when Singing Bird got sick with a fever that wouldn't break. Margaret spent 2 days and nights beside her bed, putting cool cloths on her burning forehead and forcing sips of water down her throat. The little girl was so weak she could barely open her eyes, and Margaret found herself praying to a god she'd been angry with since James died. On the 3rd night, when the fever finally broke, Singing Bird opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said the first English word any of them had spoken clearly, "Mama." Margaret's heart stopped. Then it started beating so fast she thought she might faint. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized what had just happened. This child, who had lost everything, was choosing to call her mother. This child was giving her the gift she'd thought she'd never receive. "Yes," Margaret whispered back, stroking the little girl's damp hair. "Mama's here. Mama will always be here." But even as joy filled her heart, worry gnawed at her mind like a hungry animal. Where had these children come from? Were their real parents looking for them? What would happen when the townspeople found out she was hiding Indian children in her cabin? And most frightening of all, what would happen if Comanche warriors came looking for their missing young ones? Margaret had heard the stories from other settlers. Warriors who would burn entire farms to get their children back. War parties that showed no mercy to anyone who stood between them and their families. She loved these 3 small people more than her own life already. But was her love worth the danger she might be bringing down on all of them? She tried not to think about it during the day when the children needed her attention. But at night, when they were finally asleep, the fears crept in like shadows. Every sound outside made her reach for James's rifle. Every strange noise made her check the locks on the doors. She was one woman alone with 3 children who couldn't even run if danger came. How could she protect them? How could she protect herself? The worst part was the loneliness of keeping such a big secret. Margaret couldn't tell anyone in town about the children because she knew what would happen. Some people would demand she turn them over to the cavalry to be sent to a reservation. Others would insist they were dangerous and needed to be removed immediately. A few might even suggest worse solutions that Margaret didn't want to think about. So she pretended everything was normal when she went to town for supplies, buying extra food and clothes without explaining why she needed them. She avoided her neighbors and made excuses when they wanted to visit. She built a wall of lies around her new family, knowing that the truth could destroy everything she'd come to love. But love was worth the risk, wasn't it? As Margaret watched the 3 children sleep peacefully in beds she'd made for them, she knew she would face any danger to keep them safe. They had chosen her as much as she had chosen them, and some bonds were stronger than fear, stronger than society's rules, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. Still, she kept James's rifle loaded beside her bed, and she never stopped listening for the sound of horses in the distance. Footprints in the mud by the creek made Margaret's blood turn to ice water, and she knew with terrible certainty that their peaceful world was about to shatter. The tracks were fresh, made sometime during the night while she and the children slept safely in the cabin. Big prints, made by a man who walked carefully but couldn't hide his weight in the soft earth after yesterday's rain. Margaret knelt beside the clearest print, her hands shaking as she measured it against her own foot. Whoever had made these tracks was tall, probably strong, and had been watching her property while they were all asleep and defenseless. The print showed the shape of a moccasin, not a boot, which meant only one thing: a Comanche warrior had found them. She looked up at her cabin, 50 yards away, where smoke rose peacefully from the chimney and the children were probably just waking up. Running Deer always got up first, then woke his brother and sister with gentle touches and whispered words. They would be looking for her soon, wondering where their new mama had gone so early in the morning. The tracks led from the creek, around the back of her property, close enough to the cabin that whoever made them could have looked through the windows and seen everything inside. Margaret's stomach twisted as she realized someone had been watching them, studying them, learning their routines. How long had he been out there? What was he planning to do? She followed the trail with her eyes, seeing where it came from the direction of the old Comanche hunting grounds to the north, and where it disappeared back into the thick brush that could hide an army of warriors. Was he alone, or were there others? Was this a scouting mission, or was one man preparing to take back what belonged to him? Margaret's mind raced as she hurried back to the cabin, trying to think of what to do. Should she pack up the children and run? Where could they go that would be safe? Should she send word to the cavalry in town? But that would mean admitting she'd been hiding Indian children, and who knew what the soldiers would do to 3 small Comanche kids. Inside the cabin, the children were awake and sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for breakfast like they did every morning. But something was different today. Running Deer kept looking toward the windows with worry in his dark eyes. Little Wolf sniffed the air like he was trying to catch a scent that didn't belong. Even Singing Bird was quieter than usual, playing with Margaret's silver locket but not humming her morning songs. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice normal even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Running Deer said something in Comanche, pointing toward the back of the cabin where the tracks had been. Little Wolf nodded and added his own words, both boys speaking faster than usual. Singing Bird just looked between them with wide eyes, understanding more than she could express. Margaret realized with a chill that the children knew someone was out there. They could sense things she couldn't, feel dangers that their young lives had taught them to watch for. These weren't ordinary 3-year-olds. They were Comanche children who had survived attacks, raids, and weeks alone in the wilderness. Their instincts were sharper than any white child's would be. "Is someone coming?" she asked gently, sitting down at the table with them. Running Deer nodded, his small face serious beyond his years. He pointed to himself, then to his brother and sister, then made a gesture toward the door that clearly meant someone was coming for them. Someone who had a right to take them away. Margaret's throat closed up with fear and something that felt like grief. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped for more time, more days of being their mama, more nights of tucking them into bed and singing lullabies. Now a stranger's footprints in the mud meant everything was about to change. She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful morning that felt like the calm before a terrible storm. The sun was shining, birds were singing, but Margaret could feel eyes watching her from somewhere in the trees. Whoever was out there was waiting for something, the right moment maybe, or the courage to face a white woman who had taken his children. "Are you scared?" she asked the children, turning back to them. All 3 nodded, but not in the way she expected. They weren't scared of the person outside. They were scared of what would happen to her when he came. Little Wolf pointed to Margaret, then made a slashing motion across his throat that made her stomach drop. They were worried that the warrior would hurt her for taking care of them. Margaret sat back down and pulled all 3 children close to her, feeling their small bodies trembling against hers. How could she explain that she wasn't sorry for saving them? How could she make them understand that loving them had been worth every risk, every sleepless night, every moment of fear? "Listen to me," she said, looking into each of their faces. "No matter what happens, I want you to remember that you are good children. You are brave and smart and kind. I love you, and I will always love you, no matter where you go or who takes care of you." Running Deer's eyes filled with tears, and he said something in Comanche that sounded like a promise. Little Wolf pressed his face against her shoulder, making the low growling sound he made when he was trying not to cry. Singing Bird climbed into Margaret's lap and wrapped her tiny arms around her neck, holding on like she would never let go. Outside, a shadow moved past the window, quick, silent, but definitely there. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized their visitor was getting closer, maybe preparing to make himself known. Her rifle was by the door, loaded and ready, But what good would one gun do against a Comanche warrior who could probably kill her before she could even pick up the weapon? More than that, did she really want to point a gun at someone who was probably these children's father? Someone who had been searching for his babies, worrying about them, maybe thinking they were dead? If the situation were reversed, if someone had taken James's children, wouldn't she do anything to get them back? A soft knock at the door made them all freeze. It wasn't the kind of knock a white person would make, loud and demanding. This was careful, respectful. The knock of someone who knew he was entering a dangerous situation but was willing to risk everything for the children he loved. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs shaking so badly she wasn't sure they would hold her weight. The children clung to her skirts, not wanting to let her go, but knowing she had to answer the door. This moment had been coming since the day she found them by the creek, and now it was here. She walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. On the other side was either their salvation or their destruction, and there was only one way to find out which one it would be. The man standing on her porch looked like he could kill her with his bare hands, but his eyes held the same desperate love she saw in her mirror every morning when she checked on the sleeping children. Margaret's grip tightened on the door frame as she stared at the Comanche warrior who had come for his babies, knowing that the next few minutes would decide whether her new family lived or died. He was tall and lean, built like someone who could run for days without stopping or fight a dozen men without breaking a sweat. His black hair hung in 2 braids decorated with feathers and beads, and his dark skin showed scars that told stories of battles she couldn't imagine. But it was his face that made Margaret's breath catch. The sharp cheekbones, the strong jaw, the eyes that were exactly like running deer's when the boy was trying to be brave. "You have my children," he said in English that was careful and clear, each word chosen like he was stepping across stones in a fast river. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. Behind her, she could hear the children whispering to each other in Comanche, their voices tight with emotions she couldn't understand. Were they happy to see their father? Scared of what he might do to her? Torn between 2 worlds that shouldn't have to be enemies? "They were dying when I found them," Margaret finally managed to say. "Starving. Alone." The warrior's jaw tightened, and something that might have been pain flashed across his features before he controlled it. "The soldiers came to our village. My wife." He stopped, looked away toward the horizon, then back at Margaret. "She was taken. I searched for her. I searched for them. I could not find any of them." Margaret felt pieces of a terrible story clicking together in her mind. The broken wagon by the creek. The children hiding underneath, too scared to come out even when they were starving. A father forced to choose between revenge and rescue, not knowing his babies were alive and waiting for someone to save them. "How long?" she asked. 2 moons. He said, which Margaret figured meant 2 months. 2 months of this man tracking through the wilderness, looking for his family, not knowing if they were alive or dead. 2 months of the children learning to trust her, calling her mama, becoming part of her heart. Running Deer appeared beside Margaret, slipping under her arm to stand between her and his father. He said something in rapid Comanche that made the warrior's eyes widen with surprise. Little Wolf and Singing Bird joined their brother, all 3 children forming a protective line in front of Margaret like tiny soldiers defending their fort. The warrior knelt down so he was at eye level with his children, and Margaret saw his hands shake as he reached toward them. But the children didn't run to him like she expected. Instead, Running Deer spoke again, pointing back at Margaret, his voice firm despite his young age. "What is he saying?" Margaret asked, though part of her was afraid to know. The warrior's expression was unreadable as he listened to his son. When Running Deer finished talking, the man was quiet for a long time, studying Margaret's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle that might save all their lives. "He says you are their mother now," the warrior said finally. "He says you sing to them when they have bad dreams. He says you make them not afraid." Margaret's heart broke and soared at the same time. These children, who had every reason to run back to their real father, were choosing to protect her instead. They were telling him that she belonged to them as much as they belonged to her. "They are good children," Margaret said, tears starting to blur her vision. strong and brave and smart. They have been through terrible things, but they still know how to love. The warrior stood up slowly, and Margaret saw that he was struggling with emotions as powerful as her own. This wasn't the reunion he'd expected. His children weren't running into his arms, crying with joy at being rescued. Instead, they were defending a white woman who had taken his place in their hearts. "I am Eagle Feather," he said, as if giving her his name was some kind of gift or challenge. "Margaret O'Brien," she replied, lifting her chin even though her knees felt like water. Eagle Feather looked from her to his children and back again. "You could have given them to the soldiers. You could have let them die. Why did you not?" Margaret thought about all the reasons she could give: loneliness, kindness, the need to feel useful again. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any of those things. "Because they needed a mother, and I needed children to love," she said. "Because some things matter more than what color our skin is or what language we speak." Singing Bird tugged on Margaret's skirt and said something in Comanche, then pointed to Eagle Feather and repeated a word over and over. Margaret caught the word, Ada, and realized the little girl was trying to explain who this man was. "Ada," Margaret repeated, looking at Eagle Feather. "Father," he translated, and there was something like surprise in his voice that his daughter was teaching Margaret his language. Little Wolf stepped forward and took Eagle Feather's hand, then reached back for Margaret's hand, trying to bring them together. The boy said something that sounded like a question, looking back and forth between the two adults like he was asking them to solve a problem that was too big for a 3-year-old to handle. Eagle Feather translated again, his voice softer now. "He asks why we cannot all be family together." Margaret stared at this warrior who had appeared like smoke from her worst nightmares and turned out to be a father torn apart by loss, just like she was a mother torn apart by emptiness. Little Wolf was still holding both their hands, refusing to let go, building a bridge between two worlds with his tiny fingers. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly, "but maybe we could try to figure it out." Eagle Feather's eyes met hers, and she saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't trust yet, but it wasn't hostility either. It was the look of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for so long that the idea of sharing it seemed both impossible and desperately needed. "The children are safe here," he said, looking around at her cabin, her land, the life she had built. "They are fed. They are protected." "Yes," Margaret said, "they are loved." Running Deer said something else in Comanche, and this time Eagle Feather's face showed the first hint of what might have been a smile. He knelt down again and gathered all 3 children in his arms, holding them tight while they chattered at him in their own language. Margaret watched the reunion she had dreaded and longed for, seeing the joy on the children's faces as they were finally able to hug their father again. But when Eagle Feather stood up, the children didn't stay with him. Instead, they moved back to Margaret's side, taking her hands, making it clear that their loyalties were divided. They loved their father, but they loved their new mother too, and they weren't willing to choose between them. Eagle Feather saw this and nodded slowly, like he was accepting a challenge that would test everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and love. "We will talk," he said to Margaret. "We will find a way." Dust clouds on the horizon meant trouble was riding hard toward Margaret's cabin, and she knew their fragile peace was about to be tested by men with guns and badges who didn't understand that love came in more colors than just white. Eagle Feather saw the riders first, his warrior eyes picking out details that Margaret missed. The blue uniforms, the military formation, the way they rode like men coming to solve a problem with force instead of words. "Soldiers," Eagle Feather said, his hand moving automatically to the knife at his belt. 5 men. They come fast. Margaret felt her stomach drop as she counted the approaching horses. Captain Reynolds led the group, and she recognized 2 other men from town, people who had probably been watching her, wondering why she never had visitors anymore, why she bought extra food, why she seemed different lately. The children sensed danger immediately. Running Deer grabbed his brother and sister, pulling them toward the back of the cabin where they had learned to hide during their weeks of being hunted. But Eagle Feather stopped them with a word, his voice calm but firm. "No more hiding," he told them in English so Margaret could understand. We face this together. Margaret's heart hammered as she realized what he meant. Eagle Feather wasn't going to run or hide or disappear back into the wilderness. He was going to stand with her and face whatever the soldiers brought, even though being caught with white settlers could mean death for a Comanche warrior. You should go, Margaret said quickly. I can handle this. I can protect them. Eagle Feather shook his head. You protected them when I could not. Now I protect you. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and Margaret could hear Captain Reynolds shouting orders to his men as they approached. She had maybe 2 minutes to figure out what to say, how to explain the impossible situation they were all in, how to convince armed soldiers that a Comanche warrior and 3 Indian children weren't a threat to anyone. Listen to me, she said quickly to Eagle Feather. These men are scared of Indians. They've seen too much war, too much death. If you make any sudden moves, they'll shoot first and ask questions later. Eagle Feather nodded, understanding the danger but not backing down. I have seen soldiers before. I know their ways. Margaret knew that was probably true in the worst possible way. Eagle Feather had likely fought against the cavalry, had seen his people killed by men in blue uniforms, had every reason to hate the soldiers riding toward them. But he was willing to trust her judgment, willing to try talking instead of fighting. The children moved to stand between Margaret and Eagle Feather, forming their protective line again. Singing Bird clutched Margaret's silver locket in her tiny fist like it was a magic charm that could keep them all safe. Little Wolf made his low growling sound, not loud enough for the soldiers to hear but clear enough to show he was ready to fight anyone who tried to hurt his family. Captain Reynolds and his men rode into the yard like they owned it, horses snorting and pawing the ground, dust swirling around them like a small tornado. The captain himself was a thin man with cold blue eyes and a mustache that made him look like he was always smelling something bad. Margaret had met him once in town and hadn't liked the way he looked at women like they were problems to be solved. Mrs. O'Brien, Captain Reynolds called out, staying mounted to show his authority. We've had reports of hostile Indians on your property. Margaret stepped forward, feeling Eagle Feather's presence behind her like a steady wall of strength. Captain Reynolds, I wasn't expecting visitors today. Ma'am, this is official military business, the captain said, his eyes moving from Margaret to Eagle Feather to the children. We have reason to believe you're harboring enemy combatants. The word enemy hung in the air like a curse. Margaret looked at Running Deer, who was trying so hard to be brave that it broke her heart. She looked at Little Wolf, who was protecting his baby sister with his small body. She looked at Singing Bird, who was humming under her breath the way she did when she was scared. The only people on my property are my family, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Captain Reynolds laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. Your family? Ma'am, that's a Comanche warrior and 3 Indian children. That's not family. That's an act of treason against the United States of America. One of the other soldiers, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Captain, they're just kids. Comanche kids grow up to be Comanche warriors, Reynolds snapped. And warriors kill white settlers. It's our job to prevent that from happening. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. These men saw weapons where she saw babies. They saw enemies where she saw children who laughed at her silly jokes and fell asleep holding her hand. They saw danger where she saw the greatest love she'd ever known. These children have been with me for over a month, she said, stepping closer to the captain's horse. They've never hurt anyone. They've never threatened anyone. They're 3 years old, for heaven's sake. And him, Reynolds pointed at Eagle Feather. I suppose he's harmless too? Eagle Feather stepped forward, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. When he spoke, his English was careful and clear, chosen to show these men that he was intelligent, educated, not the savage they expected him to be. I am Eagle Feather of the Comanche Nation. These are my children. This woman saved their lives when I could not find them. I come in peace to thank her and to see that they are well. In peace, Reynolds scoffed. You people don't know the meaning of the word. Margaret saw Eagle Feather's jaw tighten, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone, including Margaret. He knelt down in front of Captain Reynolds' horse, placing his weapons on the ground at the captain's feet. "I surrender myself to you," Eagle Feather said. "But I ask that you leave the woman and children in peace. They have done nothing wrong." The silence that followed was so complete Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. Eagle Feather was offering his life for theirs, willing to be taken prisoner or killed if it meant his children and their new mother would be safe. Running Deer broke the silence by running to his father and throwing his small arms around Eagle Feather's neck. He said something in rapid Comanche that brought tears to the warrior's eyes. Little Wolf and Singing Bird joined their brother, all three children clinging to their father like they could protect him from 5 armed men. Captain Reynolds looked down at the scene. A Comanche warrior surrounded by babies, a white woman standing behind them with tears streaming down her face, and his own young soldier who was clearly having second thoughts about whatever orders they'd come to carry out. "This is highly irregular," the captain said, but his voice had lost some of its harsh edge. Margaret saw her chance and took it. "Captain, I'm a widow. My husband died fighting for this country. These children were orphaned by the same war that took my James. We found each other, and we became a family. Isn't that what we're all fighting for? The right to love who we choose, to protect the innocent, to build something good out of all this destruction." The young soldier spoke up again. "Captain, maybe we should." "Quiet, private," Reynolds snapped, but Margaret could see him thinking, weighing his orders against what he was seeing with his own eyes. Eagle Feather stood slowly, his children still clinging to him. "Captain Reynolds," he said, "I know you are a soldier. I know you follow orders. But I also know you are a father. I can see it in your eyes. What would you do if someone tried to take your children from the woman who saved their lives?" And with that question, Eagle Feather had turned the whole situation upside down, challenging these men to see past uniforms and skin color to the human hearts beating underneath. Running Deer stepped away from his father's arms and walked straight up to Captain Reynolds' horse, his tiny voice cutting through the tension like a knife through butter when he spoke his first complete English sentence. "She is our mama now, and you cannot take her away." The words hit everyone in the yard like a physical blow. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she watched this brave little boy face down 5 armed soldiers to protect the woman who had saved his life. Captain Reynolds stared down at the child, his face working through emotions that had nothing to do with military orders and everything to do with the human heart. Little Wolf joined his brother, standing so close their shoulders touched, and said in his broken English, "Mama sing, Mama feed, Mama love." His words were simple, but they painted a picture that no military report could capture. The daily acts of love that had transformed a grieving widow and 3 starving children into something precious and worth fighting for. Singing Bird was the last to speak, her voice barely above a whisper as she held up Margaret's silver locket. "Mama's heart," she said, pointing to the locket, then to Margaret, then to herself and her brothers. "We live in Mama's heart." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what the children were doing. They were testifying for her, using the English words she had taught them to explain to these strangers why their family deserved to stay together. They were fighting with the only weapons they had, truth and love, and the kind of courage that only came from knowing you were protecting something more important than your own life. Captain Reynolds dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. When he knelt down to be at eye level with the children, Margaret saw something in his face that hadn't been there before. The look of a man remembering what it felt like to tuck his own children into bed at night. "How old are you?" he asked Running Deer gently. 3 summers, the boy replied, using the Comanche way of counting that Eagle Feather had taught him. "And you've been with Mrs. O'Brien for how long?" Running Deer looked back at Margaret, then at his father, clearly trying to figure out how to explain time in a language that was still new to him. "Many sleeps," he said finally, "since the cold time started." The young soldier who had been questioning the captain's orders dismounted as well, unable to stay on his horse while looking down at children who were barely tall enough to reach his knee. "Captain," he said quietly, "these aren't enemy combatants. They're babies." Captain Reynolds stood up and looked at Eagle Feather, who had remained perfectly still during his children's brave stand. "You're their father?" "Yes," Eagle Feather replied. "I am Eagle Feather, son of Chief Red Cloud, warrior of the southern Comanche. These are my children, running deer, little wolf, and singing bird. And you're willing to let them stay with a white woman? Eagle Feather's jaw tightened, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Every instinct he had probably told him to take his children and run, to get them away from white soldiers and back to their own people where they would be safe. But he had seen what Margaret meant to them, had heard them call her mama, had watched them choose to protect her instead of running to him. This woman saved my children when I could not, Eagle Feather said finally. She fed them when they were starving. She healed them when they were sick. She loved them when they had no one else. How can I take them from someone who has given them life? Margaret stepped forward, her fear replaced by a fierce protectiveness that made her voice strong and clear. Captain Reynolds, I know what this looks like. I know it goes against everything you've been taught about Indians and white people and how the world is supposed to work. But these children are not weapons or threats or problems to be solved. They are little people who have been through terrible things and deserve a chance to grow up safe and loved. Ma'am, the law is clear about harboring hostile Indians, Reynolds said, but his voice lacked the authority it had carried when he first arrived. The law, Margaret said, doesn't know what it's like to hold a fevered child all night, praying they'll live to see morning. The law doesn't know what it's like to watch a little girl learn to smile again after losing everything. The law doesn't know what it's like to find a reason to keep living when you thought your life was over. Eagle Feather surprised everyone by speaking up again. Captain Reynolds, what if I was not enemy? What if I helped your soldiers find the bad men who hurt both our peoples? Margaret turned to stare at him, not understanding what he was offering. But Captain Reynolds' eyebrows rose with interest, and she realized Eagle Feather was proposing something that could change everything. Explain, the captain said. There are Comanche who raid and kill, yes, Eagle Feather said. But there are also white men who dress like Indians to hide their crimes. Mexican bandits who steal from everyone. Bad men of all colors who use this war to hurt innocent people. I know the land. I know tracks. I know hiding places. I could help your soldiers find these men and stop them. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for so long that peace seemed impossible. Margaret held her breath, watching Captain Reynolds' face as he considered the possibility of turning an enemy into an ally. The young soldier stepped closer to his captain. Sir, if he's willing to scout for us, help us track raiders. That could save a lot of lives on both sides. And in return? Reynolds asked Eagle Feather. My children stay safe with their new mother. I work with your soldiers, but I come home to my family when the job is done. Margaret felt her heart stop. Eagle Feather wasn't just offering to help the cavalry. He was offering to make their strange little family official, to find a way for all of them to stay together despite the laws and prejudices that said it was impossible. Running Deer tugged on Captain Reynolds' coat and said something in Comanche. Eagle Feather translated with a small smile. He says you look like a good man who protects children too. Captain Reynolds looked down at the little boy, then at his siblings, then at Margaret and Eagle Feather. Margaret could see him weighing military regulations against human decency, orders against conscience, the law against love. This is highly irregular, he said finally. Sir, the young soldier said, a lot of good things are irregular. Margaret watched Captain Reynolds make a decision that would echo through all their lives. When he spoke, his voice was different, not the voice of a man following orders, but the voice of a man choosing to do what was right. Mr. Eagle Feather, he said formally, would you be willing to take an oath to serve as a scout for the United States Cavalry, with the understanding that your family will be under military protection? Eagle Feather looked at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She nodded, understanding that this was their chance, maybe their only chance, to make their impossible family work in a world that didn't want to accept them. I swear, Eagle Feather said solemnly. 6 months later, Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching Eagle Feather teach Running Deer how to track a rabbit through the tall grass. And she marveled at how love had transformed a house full of strangers into a home full of family. The morning sun painted everything golden. The children's laughter, Eagle Feather's patient voice, the peaceful landscape that had once felt empty and now hummed with life. Little Wolf burst through the door, chattering excitedly in a mixture of English and Comanche about a bird's nest he'd found in the old oak tree. His vocabulary had exploded in recent months, and Margaret loved listening to him switch between languages like someone walking back and forth across a bridge, comfortable in both worlds. "Mama, come see," he demanded, tugging on her apron with hands that were no longer thin from hunger. "Baby birds. 3 like us." Margaret laughed and let him pull her outside, where Singing Bird was humming a new song she'd learned from Eagle Feather, a Comanche lullaby about brave children and patient mothers. The little girl had become the family translator, helping Margaret learn words in her father's language while teaching Eagle Feather the Irish songs Margaret remembered from her own childhood. The cabin had changed as much as its people. Eagle Feather had built an addition where he slept, giving the children a father's protection while respecting Margaret's need for privacy. He'd also expanded the kitchen and added windows that let in more light, understanding somehow that a woman who had lived in darkness needed brightness to heal. Margaret had learned to read the signs of his return from scouting missions, the way the children would get restless the day before he came home, how they'd stand at the window scanning the horizon until they spotted the familiar figure riding across the plains. Eagle Feather never arrived empty-handed, always bringing something special. Beads for Singing Bird's hair, carved animals for the boys, herbs from Margaret's garden, and stories of the wider world beyond their peaceful valley. The townspeople in Fredericksburg had stopped whispering and started watching with something that looked like respect. Captain Reynolds had spread word that Eagle Feather was working with the cavalry, and his success in tracking down raiders had earned him a reputation that protected his family from the worst of the prejudice they might have faced. But it was the small moments that meant the most to Margaret. The way Eagle Feather would sit with her on the porch after the children were asleep, sharing comfortable silences that needed no words. The way he'd brought her wildflowers the day she mentioned missing her garden. The way he'd held Singing Bird when she had nightmares, singing to her in Comanche until she fell back asleep. Margaret had never expected to feel attracted to a man so different from James, but Eagle Feather's quiet strength and gentle wisdom had awakened feelings she thought had died with her first husband. He was nothing like the savage the army described. He was thoughtful, funny, tender with his children, and surprisingly gentle with her own bruised heart. The moment she realized she loved him came on an ordinary Tuesday when he returned from a week-long mission looking exhausted and worried. He'd been tracking a group of bandits who'd been terrorizing farms north of town, and Margaret could see the weight of what he'd seen in his dark eyes. "Bad men," he'd told her quietly while the children played outside. "They kill family, take children, make it look like Comanche work, but I know the truth." Margaret had reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. "You stopped them?" "Yes, but too late for some." His voice carried a sadness that went deeper than this one mission. Always too late for some. She'd wanted to comfort him then, to tell him that saving some was better than saving none, that his work was making a difference. But words felt inadequate, so she'd simply held his hand and let him know he wasn't alone with the burden of trying to protect people in a world full of violence. Eagle Feather had looked at their joined hands, then at her face, and something had shifted between them. Not the desperate need that had brought them together, but something quieter and stronger, the recognition that they had become partners in more than just raising children. "Margaret," he'd said, her name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before. "Yes. You make me remember what peace feels like." The words had hit her like a gentle earthquake, shaking loose feelings she'd kept buried since James died. She'd fallen in love with Eagle Feather not because he was exotic or dangerous, but because he was kind and honorable and devoted to his children, because he understood loss and chose love anyway, because he saw her not as a broken widow, but as a whole woman worth respecting. Now, watching him patiently explain animal tracks to running deer while Little Wolf climbed on his back like a monkey, Margaret felt a contentment she'd never experienced before. This wasn't the desperate love of her youth with James, built on dreams and possibilities. This was mature love, built on shared challenges and daily kindness, on watching each other choose to stay when leaving would have been easier. The children had noticed the change between their parents, and Margaret often caught them watching with the satisfaction of matchmakers who'd successfully brought together two people who belonged together. Running Deer had started calling Eagle Feather Ada and Margaret Mama in the same sentence, as if establishing their equal importance in his young world. Eagle Feather appeared beside her now, having left the children to explore the bird's nest on their own. "They are happy," he said, watching Little Wolf boost singing bird up to see into the nest while Running Deer stood guard below. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "They are. And you? Are you happy, Margaret O'Brien?" She turned to look at him, this man who had arrived in her life like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. "I am. Are you?" Instead of answering with words, Eagle Feather reached into his shirt and pulled out something small wrapped in soft leather. When he unwrapped it, Margaret saw a silver bracelet carved with symbols that seemed to tell a story in a language of pictures. "Eagle Feather," she whispered. "This is the Comanche way," he said, holding the bracelet up so the morning light caught its surface. "When a man wants to ask a woman to be his wife, he gives her something made with his own hands. Something that shows he has thought about her, worked for her, hoped for her." Margaret's heart stopped, then started beating so fast she felt dizzy. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you will marry me, Margaret O'Brien. I am asking if you will let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. If you will let our family be complete." She looked at the bracelet, at the man offering it, at the children who had brought them together and taught them both what love could accomplish when it was brave enough to cross impossible distances. "Yes," she whispered, and felt her whole world shift into place as Eagle Feather slipped the bracelet onto her wrist where it caught the light like a promise made visible. The wedding dress hanging in Margaret's bedroom had been her grandmother's, carried across an ocean and through decades of dreams. But she never imagined she'd wear it to marry a Comanche warrior in a ceremony that would scandalize half of Texas and inspire the other half. Captain Reynolds stood in her kitchen, polishing his dress uniform buttons while nervously rehearsing the words he'd say as their official witness, still amazed that military duty had turned him into a wedding planner. "Are you sure about this, ma'am?" he asked for the third time, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too many good intentions turn into disasters. "Once word gets out about this marriage, there'll be no going back. Some folks won't understand." Margaret smoothed the ivory silk that had yellowed slightly with age, but still held the magic her grandmother had promised it would. "Captain, I've spent 2 years being afraid of what people might think. I'm done living my life for other people's approval." Outside, she could hear Eagle Feather talking quietly with Running Deer about the significance of the day. The boy had appointed himself the family's official questioner, and Margaret smiled as she listened to his serious voice asking why grown-ups needed ceremonies to promise things they were already doing every day. "Because promises need witnesses," Eagle Feather explained patiently. "When people see us make vows, they help us remember them when times get hard." Little Wolf's voice piped up with typical 3-year-old logic. "But we already remember. We remember everything about our family." Margaret's heart swelled as she realized the children understood something that many adults missed. Love wasn't about ceremonies or documents or social approval. It was about showing up for each other day after day, choosing kindness over selfishness, building something stronger than the sum of its parts. Singing Bird appeared in the doorway, wearing the blue dress Margaret had made for her with ribbons that matched her father's ceremonial shirt. "Mama pretty," she announced, clapping her hands with delight. "Ada says time to start." Margaret took a deep breath and looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed widow who had stumbled through empty days 2 years ago. This woman had purpose, joy, love radiating from her face like sunshine. This woman had found her worth not in society's judgment, but in the authentic connections she'd chosen to build. The ceremony took place in the cabin's main room, with wildflowers the children had picked decorating every surface and the afternoon light streaming through windows that Eagle Feather had installed to let in more brightness. Captain Reynolds had brought his young private as a second witness, and the man's face showed wonder at being part of something so unusual and beautiful. Eagle Feather wore traditional Comanche wedding clothes, a shirt decorated with beadwork that told the story of his family's honors, leggings that his mother had made before her death, and feathers that represented his standing as a warrior and scout. But when Margaret appeared, his breath caught audibly, and she saw tears gather in his dark eyes. "You are beautiful," he said simply, and Margaret felt beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with being seen and valued by someone who knew all her flaws and loved her anyway. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat and began the ceremony with words he'd adapted from military regulations and personal conviction. "We are gathered here to witness the union of Margaret O'Brien and Eagle Feather, two people who have found in each other the courage to love across differences, the wisdom to build family from choice rather than blood, and the strength to protect what matters most." The vows they exchanged were simple but profound. Margaret promised to honor Eagle Feather's culture while sharing her own, to support his work as a scout while building their home as a refuge, to love his children as her own while remembering they belonged to both of them. Eagle Feather promised to protect Margaret's heart as carefully as he protected her body, to share his world while learning hers, to be a father and husband worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. When Eagle Feather placed his grandmother's silver wedding band on Margaret's finger, a band he'd carried through every battle and raid, saving it for a love worth waiting for, Running Deer announced solemnly, "Now we are all one family forever." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Fredericksburg had ever seen. Word had spread despite their attempts at privacy, and people came from miles around to witness the impossible marriage that was already becoming legend. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect for Captain Reynolds' endorsement, but most came because they'd heard about the woman who'd saved 3 Indian children and the warrior who'd chosen peace over war. Mrs. Kowalski brought a wedding cake that she'd decorated with both Irish shamrocks and Comanche symbols, having enlisted Eagle Feather's help to make sure she got the details right. The blacksmith from town arrived with a horseshoe he'd specially forged as a wedding gift, explaining that luck was luck regardless of what language you spoke. Even the banker who'd once pressured Margaret to sell her land showed up with a bottle of champagne and grudging admiration for her unconventional courage. But the moment that would stay with Margaret forever came when the sun began to set and Eagle Feather asked her to dance. There was no music except singing birds humming and the evening wind through the grass, but they swayed together on the porch while their guests watched and their children giggled with delight. "No regrets," Eagle Feather whispered as they moved together. "Only that we waited so long," Margaret whispered back. As the stars appeared overhead, Margaret realized that everything in her life had led to this moment. The loss of James that taught her about grief, the empty years that taught her about loneliness, the day she found 3 starving children that taught her about unconditional love. She had become the woman Eagle Feather needed not despite her suffering, but because of how she'd chosen to transform it into compassion. The last guests departed as the moon rose full and bright, leaving the new family alone with their changed world. Margaret O'Brien had become Margaret Eagle Feather, but more importantly, she had become the center of a love story that proved family wasn't about blood or tradition or what the world expected. It was about showing up for each other with open hearts and stubborn hope. The sunrise on Margaret's first morning as Eagle Feather's wife painted the Texas sky in shades of promise, and she woke to the sound of children's laughter floating through windows that no longer felt like barriers between her and the world, but like frames for a life filled with more joy than one heart should be able to hold. Eagle Feather was already up, sitting on the edge of their bed and watching her sleep with an expression of wonder that made her feel like the most precious thing he'd ever protected. "Good morning, Mrs. Eagle Feather," he said softly, testing out her new name like he was tasting honey. Margaret stretched and smiled, feeling the silver bracelet on her wrist catch the morning light. "Good morning, Mr. Eagle Feather. How does it feel to be married to a white woman?" "It feels like coming home after a long war," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "How does it feel to be married to a Comanche warrior?" "It feels like I finally understand what I was put on this earth to do." Outside, they could hear Running Deer explaining to his siblings that married people needed extra sleep, so they should play quietly until their parents were ready for breakfast. The boy had taken his role as big brother seriously since the wedding, appointing himself the family's official protector of romance and keeper of schedules. Margaret and Eagle Feather dressed quickly and joined the children in the kitchen, where chaos reigned supreme. Little Wolf had attempted to make coffee and spilled grounds everywhere. Singing Bird had tried to help by adding sugar to everything within reach, including the salt. Running Deer stood in the middle of it all, his hands on his hips like a tiny general surveying a battlefield. "We wanted to make breakfast for the married people," he announced proudly. "But cooking is harder than it looks." Margaret and Eagle Feather looked at each other and burst out laughing, the kind of deep, helpless laughter that comes from perfect happiness and the realization that family life was going to be beautifully messy from now on. They spent the morning cleaning up the kitchen disaster and making a proper breakfast together, Eagle Feather teaching the children how to cook eggs over the fire while Margaret showed them how to knead bread dough. It was ordinary and magical at the same time, the kind of moment that would become the foundation of their shared history. After breakfast, Captain Reynolds arrived with news that would test their new stability. A group of Apache raiders had been spotted near the Mexican border, and the cavalry needed Eagle Feather's tracking skills for what could be a dangerous month-long mission. "I know it's bad timing," Reynolds said, clearly uncomfortable about asking a man to leave his new wife so soon after their wedding. "But you're the best tracker we have, and these raiders have killed 3 families already." Margaret felt her stomach clench with fear. She'd known this moment would come. Eagle Feather's work as a scout meant regular separations and constant danger. But knowing something and living it were different experiences entirely. Eagle Feather's face showed his internal struggle. His duty as a scout warred with his desire to stay home with his new family, to build their life together without the threat of violence pulling them apart. "How long?" he asked. "Could be 3 weeks, could be 6. Depends on how far they've gone into Mexico." Margaret watched her husband weigh his options, and she realized this was her chance to show him what kind of partner she intended to be. She could make this harder by crying or demanding he stay, or she could make it easier by supporting the work that helped keep other families safe. "You have to go," she said quietly. "Those families need you." Eagle Feather turned to look at her, surprise and gratitude warring in his expression. "Margaret, I know what I married," she said firmly. "I married a man who risks his life to protect innocent people. I won't ask you to stop being that man just because I want to keep you safe." The children understood enough of the conversation to know their father was leaving again. Running Deer's face showed the worry of a child who'd already lost too much, but he stood up straight and tried to look brave. "We will take care of Mama while you hunt the bad men," he announced. "We are good protectors too." Eagle Feather knelt down and gathered all 3 children in his arms. "I know you are. You are the bravest children in all of Texas. But remember, your job is not to fight. Your job is to learn and grow and help your mama be happy until I come home." Little Wolf pressed his face against his father's neck. "Promise you come back?" "I promise," Eagle Feather said without hesitation. "I have too much to live for now to let anything happen to me." Margaret spent the rest of the day helping Eagle Feather prepare for the mission, checking his supplies and making sure he had extra ammunition. But the real preparation happened in the quiet moments between tasks. The way he held her hand while they sorted through his gear, the way she memorized the feel of his arms around her, the promises they made with their eyes about the life they'd build when he returned. That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret and Eagle Feather sat on the porch watching stars appear in the vast Texas sky. The night was warm and still, filled with the sounds of a world at peace. Cricket songs, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through grass. "Are you afraid?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Eagle Feather said honestly, "but not of dying. I am afraid of leaving you alone again, of breaking the promise I made to always come home to you." Margaret took his hand, feeling the calluses that told the story of his hard life, the strength that had carried him through battles and losses and the long search for his children. "Then don't break it," she said simply. "Come home to us. Come home to the life we're building, to the children who need both their parents, to the woman who loves you more than she ever thought possible." "I will," he promised. "I will come home to you, Margaret Eagle Feather, and we will grow old together watching our children become the bridge between our 2 worlds." As the night deepened around them, Margaret realized that love wasn't just about the easy moments of joy and laughter. It was about trusting each other with difficult choices, supporting dreams that required sacrifice, and believing that some bonds were strong enough to survive any distance, any danger, any challenge the world could create. She had found her worth not in society's approval, but in the authentic connections she'd chosen to build with 3 lost children and 1 extraordinary man. She had learned that family wasn't about blood or tradition or what others expected. It was about showing up for each other, day after day, with open hearts and stubborn hope. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the promise of morning, and Margaret smiled, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. She had found her home, her purpose, her place in a story larger than herself. She was exactly where she belonged.